So one of the most difficult things for me when I first started learning Spanish was filtering through some of the information that you find on the internet. There's so much information and it's really hard to know what's right and what's wrong. So with that being said, what I decided to do in this video is talk about 5 of the dumbest pieces of advice that I've seen online. Some of the things that I hear pretty often that don't really make sense now that I'm a year and a half almost into the journey of learning Spanish. So the first dumb piece of advice that I hear that is pretty common on the internet is this. People always tell you in videos and on internet forums, don't translate. And I think what they mean by that is don't try to translate word for word what words in Spanish mean in English as you're listening or as you're reading. But that just does not make sense. It's really stupid. I'm going to tell you why. There's no way for me to know when I'm in the beginning process of learning Spanish if someone's saying me doy cuenta. There's literally no way for me to know what that means without in my brain saying, okay, darse cuenta means to realize, or de vez en cuando means once in a while. Like, I get when people say you shouldn't translate word for word because it wouldn't make sense, but not translating at all literally will not make sense. There's no way for you to understand the language in the beginning, especially if you don't take what you hear in Spanish and translate it into English. And sorry, there are bugs on me. And I wanted to bring that up because I know when I first started, I thought I was doing something wrong if I would be listening to a podcast or reading a book. And I'd have to, man, these bugs are killing me. And I'd have to stop. What's going on? And I would have to stop. Sorry, I'd have to stop and try to realize, like, or try to think, okay, what did that mean in English? What does that mean? What does that mean? I would stop often and try to interpret what I was hearing and translate it. And for some reason, I thought that was the wrong thing to do. With time, what I've realized is that goes away once your brain has registered what the meaning of these words, the meanings of these words in Spanish. Once your brain registers that, that translation process goes away somewhat. But I still feel like it's an idiotic thing to tell someone in the beginning of the process of learning Spanish that you should not be translating. That's the only way you're going to realize what's being said to you and what you hear. So that's the first dumb piece of advice that I heard and that I still hear when I first started learning. Well, that I still hear about the process of learning Spanish. The second dumb piece of advice that I heard when I first started learning Spanish and that I still hear is that an effective way of learning vocabulary is to sit there and study word lists, sit there and do vocabulary studies and flashcards and all that kind of stuff. And I think this is a dumb piece of advice because number one, it's not time effective. And two, I don't think that's really how we learn words in a language, right? In English, I don't remember learning the vocabulary that I have right now through flashcards. Obviously, we do it in school, but if I'm not really using those words in context, if I'm not really exposed to those words often, they don't really stick in my vocabulary. And so the same thing will happen if you're trying to acquire a second language. I think it's just not time effective. It doesn't really serve its purpose. I've done it. I remember listening to people online say that works. I've done it, and for me personally, and I think for a lot of people because I've seen it online, it's not effective. Like, we learn vocabulary as human beings, I think, through context, through repetition, but through repetition in real life scenarios where we have context for those words. And so that's the second dumb piece of advice that I remember hearing and that I still hear, that it's wise to spend an hour sitting there memorizing vocabulary words, doing rote memorization. I don't think that's effective, and yeah, I just think that's not very wise. And I apologize. I live in Georgia, and where I live is kind of country a little bit, and so I know you can hear the country music back there from my neighbors. Hopefully I don't get a copyright strike for that, but let's go on to the third one. The third dumb piece of advice that I remember hearing when I first started learning Spanish is that the only way to truly learn a language, to truly master a language, is to be fully immersed in an environment where you're only surrounded by native speakers. And basically what that means is if you want to learn Spanish, you need to move to Mexico, you need to move to Colombia, you need to move to Spain, you need to move to Equatorial Guinea, you need to move to Peru, you need to move to all these countries, right? And I get the value in that, but there's one point that completely refutes that. And the point is, there are people that are from the United States or from other countries that have lived for years, decades in Spanish-speaking countries, and they don't speak the language. On the opposite end of that, there are people who live in the United States that have lived here for over 30 years that don't speak English. And so my point in bringing that up is just being immersed in the language does not inherently force you to learn the language. What inherently forces you to learn the language is putting in effort to study, intentionally consuming content that forces you to hear things. Because here's the point I'll add to that. If I, for example, had decided, you know what, I can't learn Spanish here in the United States, I have to move to Mexico, and me just being in Mexico will force me to learn the language, here's how that plays out. I don't speak the language, so it's hard for me to, almost impossible for me to make genuine friends, okay? friends that only speak Spanish, for example, or that want to speak with me in Spanish, because it's difficult to want to speak to somebody in a language that they don't speak. So follow my example. If I had moved to Mexico to learn Spanish, I don't speak the language in the beginning. I'm not putting any effort to learn the language, and I'm strictly just going out in society and thinking that that's going to teach me the language. That doesn't work, because the only interactions that I'll have are me going to the store and buying things, me interacting with a doorman or security guard or something. It'll be passive interactions, right? So I don't think that inherently forces you to learn the language. I think just having general effort and putting in the effort to learn and do exercises and engage with content and stuff like that forces you to learn the language more so than just plopping yourself down in a country and saying, well, I'll just pick it up. People say, you just pick up the language, you just pick it up. I don't think that's true, and I think that's a pretty dumb piece of advice. I think it leaves people disappointed when they try that and it doesn't work. The fourth dumb piece of advice that I've heard is that it is necessary to have a formal Spanish teacher to teach you Spanish. Now, I think this could apply to any language. I get this for somebody who doesn't really want to put in the time or doesn't really have the time to be self-motivated or self-disciplined. But in 2021, I don't think there's anything that, now, I do see the value in having someone that's a native speaker to speak with and to help you clarify some things, but telling someone that you can't learn Spanish on your own, or you can't get a base foundation in the language without having a formal teacher is just not true. It's dumb. Like I said, everything that a Spanish formal teacher is going to teach you, you can find online. And probably the explanations will even be better online, because it'll be from the perspective of someone that started learning English. Now, I'm not saying that there's not any value in having a native speaker help you. Obviously, that will be a contradiction, because I learned Spanish with the help of native speakers. But I'm just saying, it's a myth, it's a lie, it's dumb to say that you cannot start learning Spanish on your own and you have to hire a formal teacher. Like, there's just too many resources online. I think the value in having a native speaker is to clarify some things, teach you some of the language that's not in a book, teach you some of the nuances of the language. But it's definitely possible to learn without sitting in a formal classroom and getting taught that way. Obviously, I haven't mastered the language, but I'm an example of that. And there are thousands of people that have done that with thousands of languages. So I think that's dumb. I think that's a dumb point to bring up, to claim that you have to have a formal teacher to teach you the language. Okay, and the final point that I think is dumb when it comes to learning Spanish is that a lot of people claim that they've learned Spanish, and they recommend this. This piece of advice is that you can learn Spanish through these passive forms of learning. Like, yeah, I learned Spanish just by watching Netflix, or I learned Spanish by changing my phone into Spanish and I just learned, or I learned Spanish through any other form of passive learning like that. It's just dumb. How are you going to pick up all these words just from watching a Netflix series if you don't have context, Although the fifth point is a short point, I really just want to highlight something with this fifth point. And the point that I want to highlight is that with all of these, the key here is, in my opinion, there's no shortcut, there's no hack, there's no trick, like there's no little shortcut to learning the language. It's a matter of just sitting down and studying and reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Like, just doing those common sense things, I think, is what gets us to where we need to be. All these other rules about not translating, and what else was there? Trying to just absorb the language just through osmosis. This stuff is not, in my opinion, I wish I would have known that all this stuff is kind of just clickbait, really, to get me to watch these people's videos. It doesn't really teach you the language. And so hopefully this video helps. Hopefully I wasn't rambling too much. Hopefully I actually provided you all with some value and this helped. I will tell you that I'm not going to tell you when, but within the upcoming months, I will be visiting Peru. So I'm looking forward to, learning about Peruvian culture, history. I'll be going to Lima, Cusco, and Arequipa. And so I'm very curious to see how Peru has a very rich, first off, the food we all know is amazing, the best food in the world, they say, but rich history, rich culture. And so I'm very interested in experimenting that. So yeah, hopefully this video helped. Hopefully it provided you with some information that can be useful in your journey. If you all disagree or have any other points that you think I didn't make here, or some points that were wrong, I know that flashcard piece is something that some people swear by, but for me, I just think it's kind of dumb. But yeah, other than that, I appreciate it. Espero que estén bien y nos vemos. So the second dump. Animals, bro. I live in the jungle. These animals, man.